In 1908, a company founded inside the city would go on to employ, at its peak, more working adults than entire American states, own 11 different automakers and 19 suppliers within 2 years, and eventually produce its 50 millionth car while commanding more than half of the entire American auto market. By 1960, this one city, population barely 200,000, was building a meaningful share of every car sold in the United States, and its factories had already forced the largest corporation on the planet to its knees in a labor standoff still taught in business schools and labor history courses today. Today, the same city is known to most Americans not for anything it built, but for what came out of its taps. This is the story of Flint, Michigan, the birthplace of General Motors, and how a city that once had more good union jobs than it had adults to fill them ended up, within a single lifetime, unable to guarantee its own children clean drinking water. Flint began as a fur trading crossing, established in 1819 by Jacob Smith at the Grand Traverse of the Flint River, a spot on the Saginaw Trail that connected the young settlement of Detroit to the frontier outpost of Saginaw. Smith negotiated land exchanges with the local Ojibwe on behalf of the territorial government and was reportedly well regarded on both sides of those dealings, apportioning much of the land he acquired to his own children as the settlement slowly grew around the crossing he had founded. The village incorporated as a city in 1855, by which point Genesee County's population had reached only around 22,500 people, a small fraction of what the automobile would eventually bring. The area's real early fortune came from timber. By the 1880s, Michigan was producing as much lumber as the next 3 states combined, and the forests around Flint fed a logging economy substantial enough to fund the city's next transformation, with logs floated down the Flint River to local mills before being shipped onto markets across the growing Midwest. Revenue from that lumber trade helped establish a local carriage-making industry, and in 1886, William Crapo Durant and his partner Josiah Dallas Dort founded the Flint Road Cart Company, soon renamed the Durant-Dort Carriage Company, which grew into the largest carriage manufacturer in Michigan by the century's end, producing tens of thousands of vehicles a year under the Blue Ribbon Line that earned Durant himself the nickname King of Carriage Makers. By 1900, Flint had become the nation's leading producer of horse-drawn vehicles, turning out well over 100,000 units a year across Durant-Dort and a cluster of competing local firms, including the Flint Wagon Works and the Patterson Carriage Works, enough to earn the city its enduring nickname, Vehicle City. That nickname would prove to be an understatement. The automobile arrived in Flint almost by accident. In 1899, a plumbing fixture inventor named David Dunbar Buick, who had already made a small fortune patenting a method for bonding porcelain to cast iron, founded an engine company in Detroit that would eventually become the Buick Motor Company in 1903, but with only a handful of cars built and the company drowning in debt. Its major creditor, Flint Wagon Works owner James Whiting, bought control of the struggling operation and moved it entirely to Flint in search of the deeper local capital and manufacturing expertise the carriage trade had built up over decades. Whiting brought in William Durant, the carriage magnate, to run Buick in 1904, and Durant did what he had already proven he could do with carriages. He scaled production ruthlessly, raised more than $1 million in local capital, much of it from the same Flint families who had funded Durant-Dort, and convinced Charles Stewart Mott, whose Weston Mott Company supplied Buick's axles from a factory in upstate New York, to relocate his entire operation to Flint in 1907, a decision that would eventually make Mott the single largest individual shareholder in General Motors and, decades later, the city's most important philanthropist. Under Durant's direction, Buick became the best-selling automobile brand in the country by 1908, climbing from a company that built only 37 cars in all of 1904 to one producing thousands of vehicles a year in barely half a decade. That same year, flush with Buick's success, Durant filed incorporation papers for a new holding company built around it. He called it General Motors. Within 2 years, GM had absorbed 11 separate automakers and 19 part suppliers, an acquisition binge so aggressive that its own investors eventually voted to remove Durant from control of the company he had just created. Undeterred, Durant partnered with the Swiss-born race car driver Louis Chevrolet, built a rival automaker under Chevrolet's name, and used its runaway success to buy his way back into control of General Motors before losing it again, permanently, a few years later. Durant himself never fully recovered from the stock market crash of 1929, and spent his final years running a bowling alley in the same city where he had built one of the largest corporations on Earth. By the time Durant lost control of GM for good, the company he had founded no longer needed him to keep growing. Flint's population told the story in numbers that read almost like a fever chart. 13 to the 103 residents in 1900, 91,599 by 1920, 156,492 by 1930. An increase of more than 1,000% in 3 decades, driven almost entirely by GM's relentless hiring at its Buick, Chevrolet, Fisher Body, and AC Spark plug divisions, and pulling in both white migrants from rural Michigan and the rural South, and, in smaller but growing numbers, Black families making the same journey north that was reshaping industrial cities across the entire country. GM's Flint operations were not simply factories. They were the largest complex the company owned anywhere in the world, sprawling across the Hamilton Avenue and Chevrolet Avenue corridors in a campus of interlinked plants that together functioned almost like a small, self-contained industrial city inside the larger one. And by 1950, the corporation accounted for roughly 90% of all wage, salary, and shareholder income generated inside Flint. 80% of Flint families depended directly or indirectly on a paycheck from one of GM's local divisions. It was, in the most literal sense available in American economic history, a company town, except the company itself had been born there, which gave the relationship a depth of civic identity that few other industrial cities, even ones as dominated by a single employer as Gary or Camden, ever fully matched. That depth of dependence made Flint the obvious battleground when American auto workers finally decided to organize in earnest. Conditions inside GM's plants through the 1930s were brutal by design. Workers on the line described being unable to take a bathroom break, breathing fumes that made them physically sick, and enduring a piecework pay system that punished anyone who slowed down. You couldn't get a drink of water, one striker, Joseph Martinez, later recalled. He was tied down that closely. On December 30th, 1936, night shift workers at Fisher Body Plant No. 1, alarmed at seeing critical stamping dies being loaded onto rail cars bound for a weaker, non-union plant, simply sat down on the production line and refused to move. The tactic spread within days to Fisher Body Plant No. 2, and within weeks the strike had idled roughly 136,000 GM workers nationwide and stopped production of some 280,000 cars, spreading to plants in 14 states, even as its epicenter remained fixed in Flint. GM fought back in the courts rather than the streets at first, winning an injunction from Judge Edward Black ordering the strikers out, an order that collapsed once the union discovered the judge himself owned more than 3,000 shares of GM stock and had him disbarred from the case. On January 11, 1937, police stormed Fisher Body Plant No. 2 in an attempt to force the strikers out by cutting off heat and food, triggering a pitched battle at the plant gates that came to be known as the Battle of the Running Bulls, in which an all-women women's emergency brigade, organized and led by 23-year-old Genora Johnson, waded directly into the police lines to defend the strikers. A clash that left 16 strikers and 11 officers wounded, several by gunfire, before the police were driven back entirely. Weeks later, facing a second injunction and a court order to vacate within 2 days or face a $15 million fine against the union, Flint's strike leaders staged one of the most audacious maneuvers in American labor history. They let it be known the union intended to seize a different plant entirely. Then, at the last possible moment, redirected hundreds of strikers to take Chevrolet Plant 4 instead, the single factory producing engines for every Chevrolet assembly line in the country, catching GM's own security completely unprepared. Michigan's newly elected governor, Frank Murphy, made the decisive call that finally broke the standoff, not by sending the National Guard in to evict the strikers as GM and the courts demanded, but by deploying the Guard to protect the strikers from GM's private security and the local police instead, while President Franklin Roosevelt personally pressed GM's leadership to return to the negotiating table. On February 11, 1937, after 44 days of occupation, General Motors formally recognized the United Auto Workers as the exclusive bargaining agent for its unionized employees, a one-page agreement that granted a 5% pay raise, promised no retaliation against strikers, and historians still describe as the single most consequential victory in the history of American organized labor, the moment that transformed the UAW from a scattered collection of isolated locals into the union that would ultimately organize the entire American auto industry. Word of the victory spread through Flint that same night, in a celebration one participant later remembered as unlike anything the city would ever feel again, an entire community understanding, correctly, that it had just changed the course of American labor history from inside its own factory walls. The decades that followed the sit-down strike were, by nearly every measure, Flint's golden age. World War II briefly converted much of GM's Flint capacity to military production, tanks, aircraft parts, and ordnance rather than passenger cars, and the post-war boom that followed sent demand for American automobiles to levels the company's Flint plants had never seen even at their pre-war peak. GM's American market share climbed to 54% by 1954, the same year the company rolled its 50th millionth car off an assembly line, an achievement celebrated nationally as proof of American industrial supremacy. And Flint's factories, running multiple shifts around the clock, were central to that dominance. Charles Stuart Mott, a former GM vice president and the company's largest individual stockholder, poured his fortune into the city through the philanthropic foundation that still bears his name, funding a community college that took his name, supporting the construction of the Flint Cultural Center, and helping establish a Flint branch of the University of Michigan in 1956, a level of civic investment that gave the city an unusually rich cultural and educational base for an industrial town its size. In 1953, an F5 tornado tore through the city, killing 116 people in the deadliest single tornado in Michigan's recorded history. A genuine catastrophe that nonetheless barely slowed a boom that felt, at the time, unstoppable. The city rebuilding within a few years as if the storm had been little more than an interruption. By 1960, Flint's population reached its all-time peak of 196,940 residents, making it the second largest city in the entire state of Michigan, and city planners drafting Flint's master plan that same decade confidently projected the population would keep climbing toward 250,000. Picture downtown Flint on a Friday evening sometime around 1960, the exact year of the city's peak. Shift change at the Buick, Chevrolet, and Fisher body plants sends tens of thousands of workers streaming home at almost the same hour. Their union wages, hard won a generation earlier on this same factory floor, enough to buy a house, a car built by their own hands, and a stable, comfortable version of the American middle class that a single generation earlier would have seemed like fantasy to most factory laborers anywhere in the country. Corner taverns along Chevrolet Avenue fill within minutes of the whistle. Tool and die men still talking shop over a beer the way their fathers once talked about carriage axles. The Flint Cultural Center, funded largely by Mott money, hosts concerts and exhibitions that would not have felt out of place in a city 3 or 4 times Flint's size. University of Michigan students walk between buildings on a brand new Flint campus that did not exist 5 years earlier. At the sprawling GM Hamilton Avenue complex and the equally vast plants along Chevrolet Avenue, the machinery never really stops, running through the night to keep pace with a national appetite for American-made cars that, as far as anyone in Flint could tell in 1960, would never slacken. City planners that same year are drafting a master plan built around the confident assumption that Flint's population, already pushing 200,000, will keep climbing toward 250,000 within a generation. It is a company town built by one family's carriage business, defended by one of the most important labor victories in American history, and at this precise moment entirely unaware of how completely its fortunes were tied to decisions being made in boardrooms the city itself did not control. The first serious crack appeared not in Flint, but in the Middle East. The 1973 oil crisis, triggered by an OPEC embargo that sent gasoline prices spiraling within months, turned fuel efficiency from a minor consumer preference into an urgent national concern almost overnight. A shift that favored smaller, lighter Japanese imports over the large, thirsty sedans, and the big block V8 engines GM had spent decades perfecting in Flint's own engine plants. American automakers, and GM most of all, were slow to adapt, clinging to the same body styles and engine architectures that had dominated the American road for a generation. And Japanese manufacturers steadily ate into market share that Flint's factories had once assumed was permanently theirs. The same pattern repeated and intensified after a second oil shock in 1979, further eroding demand for exactly the vehicles Flint's plants were built to produce in enormous volume. GM's response, once it finally came, was not to rebuild Flint's competitiveness, but to reduce its dependence on it entirely. Automation, outsourcing to lower-cost, non-union states and countries, and a broader restructuring of the entire American auto industry combined to turn Flint's single greatest asset, its enormous GM-employed workforce, into its single greatest financial liability. GM's local employment, which had stood at roughly 80,000 workers in 1978, began a decline that would prove to be one of the steepest and most sustained job losses suffered by any American industrial city in the post-war era. A slide that outlasted 3 decades of subsequent corporate promises, tax incentives, and retraining programs meant to stabilize it. Flint's racial makeup shifted just as dramatically as its economy did, following almost exactly the same pattern playing out in Gary, Buffalo, and Camden at the same time. White families, many of them the same families whose grandparents had arrived from rural Michigan in the South to work the original Buick and Chevrolet lines, left the city for its surrounding suburbs through the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s in a wave of white flight accelerated by the same interstate highway construction reshaping cities across the entire country. Black families, many of whom had themselves arrived in earlier decades specifically to work GM's plants, and had built a substantial, and in Michael Moore's own recollection largely invisible, presence inside the city he grew up in, made up an increasingly large share of a shrinking population left behind, and today make up a clear majority of the roughly 80,000 people who still call Flint home. The unraveling accelerated through the 1980s under a wave of plant closures that Flint-born filmmaker Michael Moore would later document, with bitter comic fury, in his 1989 film Roger and Me, which followed GM Chief Executive Roger Smith's decisions to shutter Flint factories even as the corporation posted healthy profits elsewhere, and which introduced much of the rest of the country to a version of Flint defined almost entirely by abandonment, repossession, and civic desperation. The film's title character, Smith, declined every one of Moore's repeated requests for an interview throughout the production, a running joke that became the documentary's structuring device and, for many viewers outside Michigan, their first introduction to what deindustrialization actually looked like at street level. Buick City, a massive combined assembly and bodybuilding complex built in the 1980s and modeled explicitly on Toyota's own integrated Toyota City plant in Japan, an attempt to import the very manufacturing philosophy that had helped Japanese automakers outcompete Flint in the first place, was itself shuttered in 1999 and demolished between 2001 and 2003. An ironic bookend to a strategy that had once looked to Japanese manufacturing as a model to imitate rather than an existential threat. By 2010, GM's Flint workforce had collapsed to under 8,000 employees, roughly 10% of its late 1970s peak of 80,000, and the population followed the jobs out of the city almost in lockstep, falling well below 100,000 by the 1990s and continuing to slide from there. Flint's downtown skyline bore the scars directly. The Genesee Towers, once the tallest building in the city, opened in 1968 as a monument to a downtown still expecting to grow, but sat unused and structurally unsound for years, a cautionary sign warning of falling debris eventually posted on the sidewalk beneath it before an investment firm purchased the entire building for $1 and had it imploded in December 2013. Crime filled much of the vacuum industry left behind, and for a stretch of years in the 2010s, Flint was regularly named among the most dangerous cities in the entire United States on a per capita basis, a grim national label that sat uneasily alongside a genuinely rich cultural legacy the city had built during its boom years and never entirely lost. Home to one of Michigan's largest art museums and its largest planetarium, even as entire residential blocks a few miles away emptied out and were slowly reclaimed by weeds. By the early 2010s, the accumulated damage of 3 decades of deindustrialization had left Flint's municipal government in a state nearly as fragile as its economy. The city's tax base had shrunk in step with its population. Its pension and retiree health care obligations from the GM era remained enormous relative to its shrunken budget, and Flint churned through mayors, financial consultants, and stopgap fixes without ever solving the fundamental math of a city built to serve 200,000 people trying to fund itself on the tax revenue of 80,000. Water and sewer infrastructure, much of it laid down during the original vehicle city boom a century earlier, aged well past its intended lifespan with little money available for the kind of preventive maintenance a wealthier city could have afforded. It was against this backdrop of financial desperation that Flint's final defining catastrophe arrived, and this one came out of the tap. Michigan had first placed Flint under a state-appointed emergency manager back in 2002, and when the city's finances deteriorated again, Governor Rick Snyder appointed a new sequence of emergency managers, beginning in 2011. Stripping Flint's own elected government of most of its budgetary authority in the name of fiscal discipline. As part of a plan to save money by eventually joining a new regional pipeline authority instead of continuing to buy treated water from Detroit, one of those emergency managers, Darnell Early, switched Flint's drinking water source in April 2014 away from the treated Lake Huron supply the city had relied on for nearly 5 decades, routing water instead through the Flint River as a supposedly temporary cost-cutting measure while the new pipeline was under construction. The river water was significantly more corrosive than the Detroit system's supply, and state environmental regulators failed to require the corrosion control treatment that would have prevented that corrosive water from stripping lead directly out of the service lines, running into thousands of older Flint homes, many of them installed between 1901 and 1920, back when lead pipe was simply the industry standard. Residents complained almost immediately about the water's color, smell, and taste, describing skin rashes, hair loss, and itching after bathing in it, and General Motors itself stopped using Flint water at one of its own remaining local engine plants after the water began visibly corroding freshly machined parts, a warning sign from the very company that had built the city that state officials chose not to heed. Through 2014 and into 2015, the city issued boil water advisories after detecting dangerous bacteria, and in January 2015 acknowledged that cancer-linked trihalomethanes had exceeded federal limits, all while continuing to insist the water remained safe to drink. It took independent researchers, not the state, to expose what was actually happening inside Flint's homes. In September 2015, Flint pediatrician Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha published findings showing that the share of Flint children with elevated blood lead levels had nearly doubled citywide since the water switch and had nearly tripled in some neighborhoods, a discovery Michigan's own health department initially tried to dismiss before ultimately confirming it. An independent Virginia Tech research team led by Dr. Mark Edwards separately confirmed extreme lead contamination inside Flint homes around the same time. A simultaneous outbreak of Legionnaires' disease, a severe and sometimes fatal form of pneumonia, later linked to the same compromised water system, killed at least 12 people and sickened roughly 90 more between June 2014 and October 2015, one of the largest such outbreaks ever recorded in the United States. Nearly 100,000 residents in a city that was by then overwhelmingly poor and majority black had been exposed to contaminated water for a year and a half before the state finally admitted the crisis it had caused. The city switched back to the Detroit water system in October 2015, and newly elected Flint Mayor Karen Weaver, the city's first female mayor, took office that November, declaring the water crisis her administration's central and immediate priority, and declared a local state of emergency the following month, pledging what she called a 100-day plan to begin fixing the pipes the state's own emergency managers had left contaminated. Governor Snyder followed with his own state of emergency declaration for Genesee County in January 2016, activated the Michigan National Guard to help distribute bottled water and filters door to door, and eventually secured a federal disaster declaration and $5 million in emergency aid from President Obama. Snyder's own task force, in a final report released that March, placed primary responsibility for the disaster squarely on the state and its environmental regulators, singling out the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality by name, and explicitly characterized the crisis as a textbook case of environmental injustice, one in which Flint's poor, majority black population had plainly not received the same protection from environmental hazards that wealthier, whiter communities took for granted, a conclusion that echoed almost exactly the language regulators and historians would later use to describe similar failures in Camden and dozens of other American cities built around a single vanished industry. The reckoning that followed was long, expensive, and, in the end, only partially satisfying to the people who had actually suffered. Michigan's Attorney General ultimately filed criminal charges against 15 current and former state and city officials, including involuntary manslaughter charges tied directly to the Legionnaires' deaths, and in January 2021 charged former Governor Snyder himself, along with his one-time public works director, with 2 counts of willful neglect of duty. 9 defendants eventually pleaded no contest to misdemeanor charges, a resolution that avoided further trial, but also avoided any admission of the deeper willful neglect prosecutors had originally alleged. But the case against Snyder collapsed on procedural grounds after the Michigan Supreme Court ruled that the unusual one-man grand jury process used to indict him and several others had been improperly convened in the first place, a decision a Genesee County judge relied on to formally dismiss the charges against Snyder in December 2022, upheld on further appeal by the state's Supreme Court in October 2023. The lead prosecutor's own team, in a statement released after the ruling, called the decision the final nail in the coffin of the Flint water prosecutions, a blunt admission that a decade of investigation had produced settlements, but no criminal accountability at the top. No government official, at any level of the state or city government, ultimately faced a criminal conviction for a crisis that a state-appointed official had personally set in motion to save a relatively small amount of money. Civil litigation fared rather better for residents, at least financially. Michigan, the city of Flint, the McLaren Hospital System, and an engineering firm involved in the water switch ultimately agreed to settlements totaling more than $626 million, later reported as high as $659 million once additional defendants were included, with the large majority of that money legally required to go to the children who were under 18 at the time of their exposure, compensation for permanent harm, including lasting cognitive and developmental effects that no settlement check could ever fully undo. Residents separately sued 3 investment banks, J.P. Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, and Stifel Nicholas, alleging the banks had underwritten the very bond sale that financed Flint's ill-fated pipeline plan, while knowing it depended on using untreated river water as an interim source. The physical infrastructure took even longer to fix than the courts took to litigate it, replacing tens of thousands of individual lead and unknown material service lines across a city with famously unreliable records, dragged on for nearly a decade past the crisis's initial discovery. Of an estimated 43,000 total service lines in Flint, roughly 3,500 were confirmed lead, and another 9,000 were made of galvanized steel that could still harbor lead particles, with a further 9,000 lines of entirely unknown material, a records gap that itself became a years-long engineering project just to map before a single pipe could be replaced. The city of Flint was held in civil contempt of federal court as recently as March 2024 for repeatedly missing its own court-ordered replacement deadlines under a settlement meant to guarantee the work actually got finished. The final lead pipe in the city was not replaced until July 1st, 2025, with the state reporting roughly 11,000 lead lines replaced and more than 28,000 damaged properties restored in the process. And only weeks earlier, in May 2025, did the Environmental Protection Agency formally lift the emergency order it had placed on Flint's water system back in 2016, more than a decade after the crisis began. By the numbers, the water Flint residents drink today meets every federal and state safety standard, with lead levels well below the legal action threshold, supported by ongoing corrosion control treatment and regular testing. By the numbers that matter more to the people who lived through it, trust has proven far harder to restore than pipe. Surveys conducted years after officials first declared the water safe still find large numbers of Flint residents who continue to rely on bottled water or filters rather than their own taps, an understandable habit after being told for 18 straight months by nearly every level of government that water they could see and smell was contaminated was actually fine to drink. A 2022 study published in the journal JAMA Network Open found that roughly 1 in 5 Flint residents met the clinical criteria for presumptive major depression and 1 in 4 for post-traumatic stress disorder, with more than 1 in 10 meeting the criteria for both, lasting psychological wounds from a crisis whose physical remediation is only now, a full decade later, considered complete. Flint today counts somewhere around 79,000 to 80,000 residents, a population that has essentially leveled off after cratering from its 1960 peak of nearly 197,000, less than half of what the city once held, with roughly a third of the city living below the poverty line, and a median household income under $38,000 a year, figures that place Flint among the poorest cities of its size anywhere in the country, water crisis or not. The old Buick City site, demolished down to bare ground in the early 2000s after standing vacant for years, now hosts a scaled-down pipe manufacturing operation run by an Alabama-based company in a small planned residential development, University Park, the first genuinely new housing built in the city in more than 3 decades, modest signs of reinvestment on land that once housed one of the largest integrated automobile complexes on the planet. The Flint Cultural Center that Charles Stewart Mott's fortune helped build still operates today, home to the second largest art museum in Michigan and the state's largest planetarium, evidence that not everything the city built during its golden age was demolished or defunded along with the factories. General Motors itself never fully left. A handful of plants, employing a small fraction of the tens of thousands the company once put to work here, still operate in Flint. And in 2013, GM purchased the original Durant Dort Carriage Company buildings on Water Street, taking over their maintenance from the local historical foundation, a modest, almost quiet gesture of stewardship toward the exact spot where the corporation, and eventually the crisis that would define it in the national imagination a century later, both trace their origins, stand today at the corner of Chevrolet Avenue, where Fisher Body Plant No. 1 workers first sat down on a production line in December 1936 and forced the largest corporation in the world to recognize their union. And there is very little left standing to mark what happened there, a handful of historical markers, and a preserved building or two amid blocks that have been cleared, rebuilt, or simply left empty since the plants themselves came down. Drive a few miles further into the city's residential neighborhoods, and the story shifts again, from vacant industrial land to modest homes where, as recently as a decade ago, parents were mixing baby formula with water. They had every reason to believe was poisoning their own children, homes where bottled water still sits stacked in kitchens today, not because the water is unsafe any longer, but because nobody in Flint who lived through 2014 and 2015 can entirely be blamed for no longer trusting a government report that says otherwise. Flint invented itself twice, first as the carriage capital of America, then as the birthplace of its largest automaker, and both times the city bet everything on a single, all-consuming industry that eventually decided it no longer needed as many of the people who had built it. What Flint could not have anticipated in either boom was that the final blow would not come from a foreign competitor or an automated assembly line, but from the water flowing out of its own taps, the most basic promise any government makes to the people who live inside it, broken here for 18 months, while officials insisted again and again that everything was fine and only fully repaired pipe by pipe, more than a decade after anyone in Flint stopped believing them.